Who decides what defines the moment of death? That's the question at the heart of two stories involving people who've been declared brain dead. And this is not the traditional Terry Schiavo scenario of who in the family has the final say. This is the government and hospitals versus families. Joining us to discuss are Dr. Arthur Kaplan, Director of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Medical Center, Alan Meisel, Director of the Center for Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Pittsburgh, and Chris Dolan, who's the lawyer for the family of Jahi McMath. Jahi is a 13-year-old girl in California whose tonsil surgery led to tragic complications, which led to her being pronounced brain dead by doctors. But she still has a heartbeat, and for her family, that's enough. Against state and doctors' decisions, they've fought to keep her on a ventilator at a children's hospital in Oakland. The family and the hospital reached an agreement, and Jahi has been transferred to a facility where she's being cared for. But is there any point? Chris, let's kick it off with you. You represent this family. Do you believe there's any medical hope that Jahi will one day be a conscious, active, living person again?
Well, I think it's important to note that I'm not a doctor. So for me to express medical opinions, much like I believe the others on this panel, I believe would be inappropriate. I think that there's always hope that there could be life that would be returned to Jahi, though I know the panelists will disagree with me. There are several documented cases where there have been individuals diagnosed with brain death who have evolved from that. But again, I think it's important to note that I'm not a physician.
I'm interested in the family's hopes as well, of course. I'm also interested in the question of, do you think that it matters? And does the family think that it necessarily matters whether medically it's plausible that she could recover, since presumably they think that they should have the right to be able to keep her heart beating either way?
I don't think that you can separate the family's beliefs from the family's hopes. And I think that the context of this case, as it happened during the holiday season, the Christmas season for them, is important because we were praying to a God who brought a son here by a miracle, who then committed miracles that included the raising of the dead, who died and was resurrected as a miracle. So when you bring in their beliefs as Christian beliefs, you have to call your own beliefs into question and wonder, do we practice a fiction, which is miracles happened only once a long time ago, or do we practice a real belief?
What's the end game here? What would the family ultimately like to happen, presuming that there is not a radical recovery?
Well, I think that if there's not a radical recovery, the family is going to evaluate what the condition of Jahi is and have an opportunity then to make a decision. The mother has publicly stated that if her daughter deteriorates or if her daughter becomes in pain, that she will make the decision, as any responsible parent would, to remove her from a ventilator. But this family was also in a very stressful situation with a hospital that they believe may have been involved in negligence, seeking to disconnect life support. And they were actually not only pressured, they were yelled at one point in time about, what don't you understand about your daughter being dead? She's dead, dead, dead. And their religious beliefs were completely disregarded.
Dr. Kaplan, let's talk about the medical components of this. What if a person is pronounced brain dead but still has a beating heart? What's their prognosis?
So I'm not a doctor either, but I do understand what the concepts are, and I've read the law and understand the literature here. So brain death means total irreversible loss of all brain function. It's recognized as the adequate fulfillment of death by law in 45 states, including where Jahi is. If you looked at the various medical groups that have issued pronouncements about brain death, when properly done, but with the right expertise and knowing the causal etiology of why it occurs, people do not recover from brain death. So I think we could say the chances of that are not good at all.
And what are the ethics then of perpetuating that life? I mean, what's the downside? I can imagine a lot of people thinking, well, where's the harm in just keeping her alive just in case that miracle does happen?
Well, I think from the point of view of physicians, their ethics says stop when death has occurred. It's a bright line. They believe that their skills can no longer help when a person is dead. So part of this isn't just about the family, part of it is about what the providers think. The other issue gets into cost and allocation of resources. We don't have to get into the details of what took place in her case, but generally, people want to move on to the next patient. The staff doesn't want to be tying up resources with someone whom they think they can no longer benefit. They believe futility has occurred when death comes. And in an average ICU with a cost of about $7,500 to $10,000 a day, society, someone's going to be picking up this tab when a family or an individual says, I don't want to give up, I want my child or my loved one maintained. We do have cost issues in the background.
Chris, were you trying to jump in there?
I was, but let's be real honest about what's behind the diagnosis of brain death legally. Because I think what you're talking about should be addressed, cost-benefit analysis, but we don't generally do that in human life. What the designation of brain death was designed to do was to have a point in time in which the organs could be removed from a body while the heart was still beating. That is one instance. And the other was so that the legal system could declare someone dead and prosecute a homicide. And the third reason was to give families the right to disconnect life support. But what this hospital did was to create a fourth reason, which is the one that you just described, which is it's demoralizing for our folks to have to provide treatment, and the monetary trade-off between one person's idea of life and another's weighs in fortune of pulling the plug.
And my view is not in agreement with that. I think if you look at the committees that were formed way back when I was at the Hastings Center back in the early 70s, the Harvard Committee, the Minnesota Committee, others that met to think through the whole idea of brain death, they wanted to be able to know when to shut off machines. Yes, organ transplant was certainly a consideration. That's absolutely true. But there are many physicians saying we have these machines, dialysis, ventilators, the heart-lung machine. When someone's still there and we believe them, for example, to have been shot in the head with the top of their head missing, and yet we can maintain a heartbeat, what do we do? The old definition won't work.
Chris,
Alex,
sorry, yeah, Alan, jump in because I do want to get you in.
Yeah,
but
I'd like to jump in on one point that Chris made, and he said that we don't use cost-benefit analysis in determining and evaluating human life. I think that's absolutely incorrect. I think we do it all the time. We decide whether or not it's worth it to get rid of a railroad grade crossing. We know that somebody's going to get killed at that railroad grade crossing, and yet we don't spend the money to do it. We have cost-benefit analyses across the board here, and that's involved in this case as well. And what I would say is that in this case, the cost is high and the benefit is virtually zero. The only benefit, because Jahi is dead. That's by calling her brain dead, we're making a mistake, a serious error, and we're misleading the public. She is dead, and her body is going to decompose in a very short period of time, because pumping blood through a body that has no brain that is functioning is not going to work.
just unpick the nuance here for us, Alan, about what brain death means, because I think a lot of people are very confused. Let's define for ourselves what brain death is, what a vegetative state is, what unconsciousness is, and what the difference between those things is.
Well, I'll make the same disclaimer the other participants
I think we can all accept that we don't have a medical professional here.
But that's critical, because everybody here is making medical diagnoses of whether somebody's dead or alive. And the ethics of that are actually irresponsible for anyone but a doctor to comment.
No one's diagnosing.
Well, three neurologists
are talking about definitions.
On that. I'm merely basing my comments on the facts of the case.
But make it specific that it's someone else's diagnosis, because you're saying she's dead, and that is actually inappropriate.
So did the coroner.
According to the coroner and under California law, she's dead. I take your point,
Right.
Chris, that none of us are healthcare professionals, but in the interest of defending the production of this particular segment, we didn't think that it was necessary to have a healthcare professional in order to opine on something that is established under California law. Just since we're talking about the issue of money, how is this being funded? How is the life support funded? Chris?
Well, in this particular case, there are donations that are currently providing for some of that. Previously, it was through insurance that was provided. And I don't want to get too much into the family's privacy, but ventilator support on those who are determined not to be brain dead, which can go all the way down to the issue of what's called a vegetative or comatose state, is often provided by insurance. And the question becomes, if somebody is comatose, are we going to move the line there? If they're in an irreversible coma or in a vegetative state, what creates this line in which we will not call somebody dead?
So let me jump in here just to say, this doesn't require a medical degree. One thing I know very well, if there's anyone in America who believes that brain death is death, it is third-party payers. Insurance companies never, and I say never, pay when someone's declared dead either by brain death or cardiopulmonary death. So
what about New Jersey, Alan?
We've gone.
What about New Jersey? Are you telling me that insurance companies in New Jersey suddenly cut off people who are on ventilators when they don't provide consent, which is their right under New Jersey statute for religious reasons?
No, because they've built an exception into the brain death law. But when brain death is declared in the 49 other localities, including the one you're in, payment absolutely ceases. Don't you believe that?
Okay, but you said every insurance company, and I think that this is where the problem is.
When death has come.
Well, see, death has not come in New Jersey, even though somebody's been diagnosed brain dead, unless the family agrees. They cannot issue a death certificate unless the family agrees over their religious objections. So unless the whole state of New Jersey is unethical, you can't make these sweeping pronunciations.
I don't want to get too down in the weeds of the specifics of New Jersey health law, but I do want to take a look at the second story in this scenario, which deals with these issues. It's in Texas, and Marlise Machado Munoz was declared brain dead last year. But because she was 14 weeks pregnant at the time, state law requires hospitals to keep her on life support until the fetus is delivered. Her family wants Machado, who's now 20 weeks pregnant, to be removed from life support and is planning to take legal action. Alan, we have legal and ethical ideas about when it's acceptable to terminate the life of a fetus. Is it ethical to sustain the life of a brain-dead woman merely as a vessel in which another life can gestate?
Are you asking me, is it ethical or is it legal?
Ethical.
Art, I'm going to defer to you on this.
Arthur?
But I'll be glad to comment on the legality.
Yeah, okay, Alan, let's start with the legality of it, and we can move on to the ethics.
Right. I think that under Texas law, there are any number, and American law, constitutional law, there are any number of reasons to conclude that she should not be maintained on life support, and it's violative of the law. First of all, the Texas law in question refers to patients. And I think that when the legislature used the word patients, they had in mind people who were alive, not people who were dead. Now, of course, it's up to the Texas courts to decide that, but I think that's a pretty reasonable interpretation, one with which many people would agree. Second, from a constitutional perspective, I have long thought that laws like this, and Texas is not the only state that has a law like this, violates equal protection because it denies women the right to make decisions on their own. Also, these laws refer and were intended to deal with people in a vegetative state, people who are alive. They may have very limited brain function, but they are alive, unlike someone, as the woman in this case, who is brain dead, who has no functioning of her brain, whatever.
Alan, earlier you were pointing to the fact that a brain-dead person's body gradually decays. Is that not a concern in this case? Well,
I don't know. Again, I don't know what the medical facts are, and I'm not a physician. Eventually, that could happen. Whether or not the life support system that she is attached to will keep the fetus alive throughout the pregnancy, or at least up until viability at about, say, 24 weeks or so, it remains to be seen. I mean, I hope it doesn't for her sake, but if they keep her on the life support system, we'll then know whether or not the fetus will be delivered alive.
Arthur, I think that most people would probably agree that if a woman were 1 week pregnant and she became brain dead, that it would be ridiculous to try to keep her alive. A lot of people would agree with that. Some religious people wouldn't. And they would also agree that if she were almost 9 months pregnant, then you would want to keep her alive and just see the baby through to fruition. How do you pass this grey area where she's between sort of 14 to 20 weeks and may just tip over viability?
Yeah, good question. We just had a meeting here with our neonatologists, some of our obstetricians. Part of the answer to the question, is it ethical to try, does hinge on the experience to date when people have asked to continue the pregnancy even though the person has died. And as often the case, some of the answers in the details. At 1 week, Most programs would not try because they don't think they could keep a body going in the way you just asked Alan, to the point where it would be safe for the fetus. At 1 day before birth, I'm told by my colleagues here, absolutely, they would try to C-section that child out. In between, we get to 3 or 4 other things to think about in terms of the ethics. There have only been 30 cases in the literature of people who've tried to do this over the past 20 to 25 years. Every physician will tell you it's an experiment. They don't know what the outcomes are going to be because they're disparate. Do we compel people to engage in experiments? No. We have a whole separate attitude that gives them more freedom. Outcomes, about a quarter of the infants, of the fetuses who were maintained in dead bodies died, but that's at different points in time. And the injury matters. The woman in Texas went without oxygen a long time. And in other instances, there could be a traumatic accident or some other injury that caused the death of the mom, but it wouldn't necessarily impact the fetus in the way that oxygen deprivation does. So short answer, is it ethical to try? Sometimes. Is it always the same set of facts? No. Who's in the best position to decide? Probably the family and the husband, more than, if anyone, the Texas legislature, about the details of that.
Chris,
but that brings up, this is essentially the issue that we're talking about. The same right to choose is at the beginning of this scenario and the end of the scenario. I'm sure that all lawyers would agree with me. Well, maybe not all. We never agree on anything. But as it relates to the issues that are raised, it's not just equal protection. It's the First Amendment, freedom of expression of religion. It's the 4th and 14th Amendments of your rights to medical privacy. I mean, if you look at the Baby K case, which dealt with these very issues, those were some of the issues that arose here. So who gets to make those decisions? Is it the family or is it the hospital? And I find it remarkable that at one end of the spectrum, as it relates to somebody who's brain dead, we now have an indication that the family should make the decision whether she stays on or off, even though she might deteriorate. But Chris, at the other end of the spectrum, we're saying it's the hospital.
But Chris, surely it matters that A, we're talking about a potential human life in the form of the fetus, and B, we're talking about a father who is still alive, who's presumably going to have to raise his child against his own wishes. I mean, that's the fundamental difference between the two cases, is it not?
It's the emerging interest of that fetus that makes all the difference here in terms of why they're not symmetrical.
And the dad. I mean, this is someone who's going to have to raise this child, a widower, and may not want to. Thanks to all three of you for starting to delve into this. It's a tricky topic. I wish we had more time to cover it.
Thank you.
You've been great.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. Plenty more stories coming up right here on HuffPost Live.